All right, let's begin with Chapter 1, Introducing Interpersonal Communication. So before we start, let's put some things into perspective, shall we? Personal experience isn't the same as systematic training. So even though we are in relationships constantly, we have effective ones, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are perfect at communicating. I'm not accusing you of being crappy communicators, but just because we do something over and over, it doesn't necessarily mean we're doing it correct. So let me give you an example. If you play sports, let's say you play baseball and you're a pitcher. If you don't have the right form, it doesn't matter how many times you throw that ball. If you don't have the right form, it's not going to be effective necessarily, right? So just keep that in mind. Also, you'll be glad you took this class. That's not me saying that for my ego or anything. I just mean the content speaks for itself. I remember being in college and being frustrated having to take basic level courses that were part of the core curriculum that I knew I was never going to use with my major. But this is one of those very few, I don't want to say very few, but this is one of those classes that you are going to use, and it applies to every single one of you, no matter what your major is, okay? All right, let's define communication. You don't need to write down the definition, but I would be remiss if I didn't include the definition for communication in a communication class. So the National Communication Association defines communication as the process through which people use messages to generate meanings within and across contexts, channels, and media. I don't know why there's an extra comma there. Sorry. And then cultures. I think culture, what? I don't know what happened to my slide. I'm so sorry, y'all. Cultures should be after context. I don't know what happened. So there's 5 features that characterize communication. So communication is a process. It happens over time. It is a process. It's not just a one-time thing, okay? We create messages to convey meanings. Again, we're starting at the very basic level, okay? Very, very basic. We create these messages to convey meanings. We make meaning out of the messages, but we know that people are making meaning out of the messages that we give and provide, so that's why we create those messages, to convey that meaning to people. We use various modalities for exchanging messages. So with modalities, I want you to think of another term could be channels. And I don't mean like TV channels, but we communicate a lot of different ways. It might be through email. It could be through text message. It could be through social media, like on TikTok or Instagram. We communicate in a lot of different ways. Okay. It could be face to face, but it could also be FaceTime and, so different ways that we communicate. Think of different channels when we're talking about modalities. We transmit information through sensory channels. So when we talk about sensory channels, literally think of the 5 senses. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about nonverbal, but believe it or not, we communicate a lot of different ways, including, for example, smell, right? Like the way that we smell communicates something. I know some of you are like, ugh, but it's true. And then we convey meaning through different contexts. So with context, think of just different situations, okay? So what is interpersonal communication? A lot of students tell me, and that doesn't hurt my feelings. I didn't know necessarily what it was when I signed up for it when I was in college. What is interpersonal communication? So there's the definition right there. Again, you don't need to write it down because it's kind of broken down into the 4 implications. But by definition, it is a dyadic form of communication between 2 people in which the messages exchanged significantly influence their thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships. So 4 implications in this definition. Let's break it down. Interpersonal communication, IPC is interpersonal communication, is dynamic rather than static. So what we mean by dynamic is it is constantly changing, okay? It is constantly changing. Much interpersonal communication is transactional. So with transactional, think of literally like a transaction. When you go buy something, that you purchase something and then they give you something else. It's transactional. The reason why it's not every type of interpersonal communication is transactional is because sometimes we don't get a reply, right? Like sometimes we just put a memo on the board in the break room and people might not necessarily respond to it, okay? Most of the interpersonal communication is transactional, but not always, so just keep that in mind. But for the most part, we're receiving feedback. Interpersonal communication is dyadic, dyad meaning two. Interpersonal communication is communication between two people, okay? Now, what that means is it covers the gambit of friendships, romantic relationships, family members, family relationships. Now, since it's between two people, we're not studying the family as a whole. We are talking about two people in that relationship. It can also be coworkers, acquaintances, stuff like that. You don't need to take note of this, but just something to know about the class and just the discipline in general. There are theories and there are studies about what's called zero history groups, aka strangers. But mostly what we're going to be studying in this class is going to be established relationships, even if it's acquaintances. So yes, technically communication between you and the barista at Starbucks is interpersonal communication, and there are theories about different, again, there in research it's referred to as zero history groups, also known as strangers, meaning you don't have history with them, you don't know them. But in this class, and I would argue most of the research over interpersonal communication is going to be established relationships. And lastly, interpersonal communication creates impact. Okay, it creates impact. That sounds a little bit more dramatic, but if you think about it, it can be that dramatic. So yes, there are implications that someone says something or does something and it impacts the relationship, but also the relationship, it kind of goes with it being dynamic. It's constantly changing, and that's because everything we do and say in a relationship impacts that relationship, okay? All right, so let's move on. Principles of interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication conveys both content and relationship information, okay? So there's the content level of meaning and relationship level of meaning. When you think of content level of meaning, think of like the basic dictionary definition for that word. So let me give you an example after I go over relationship. So content level, just the basic definition of what that means. Relationship level of meaning is it might mean something different based on that relationship. Okay, so let me give you an example of how this can work. The term dumb, you're like saying something is dumb. What does that mean? Unintelligent, stupid, a synonym, not aware, or it can even be like kind of silly. So if you're with your friends and you're just joking around and one of your friends is like, "You're so dumb," as y'all are laughing, you're going to take that probably incredibly different than if I were passing back papers and I handed a student their paper and I said, "You're so dumb," as I was sitting there setting their paper down. First of all, I would never do that, but that's the relationship level of meaning that's different than the content level of meaning, right? So just something to be aware of. Interpersonal communication can be intentional or unintentional. The goal of this class is not to make y'all completely paranoid, but it is to make you aware, okay? Whether we realize it or not, we are constantly communicating. So we can be intentional with how we're communicating and what we're communicating, but it can also be unintentional, where we don't realize what we're communicating. So for example, if someone looks at their watch and that could communicate that they're in a hurry or that they're bored and want the interaction to be over. But maybe that's just like a nervous thing that they do. It's just they're just so used to it. It's like a habit that they just look at their watch. They don't care what time it is, okay? Maybe they got a new watch that they saved up for and they're excited and they just can't, they're just looking at it because they're just excited about it, okay? Interpersonal communication is irreversible. So we can't take things back. And I know y'all know that. We're going to talk more about it in verbal communication, but what has been communicated has been communicated. It is irreversible. We can't take it back. And it's dynamic. We kind of already went over that. It is constantly changing. All right. Is interpersonal communication trivial? If there is an entire class based on it, the answer is no. So what are our goals? Have you ever thought about what our goals are when we're communicating? So we have 3 in interpersonal communication. Self-presentation goals are how we present ourselves. It's as simple as it probably sounds. Self-presentation goals, how we come across. Are we being our true selves? Are we being honest with who we are? Okay, how we come across and how we navigate our identity. Instrumental goals, there's not always meaning assigned to what we communicate and how. Sometimes we just need to get stuff done. So same example of going to Starbucks and ordering a drink, an instrumental goal. Our goal is not to make a friend, usually. It's to get a drink and get that order in. And then relationship goals. In interpersonal communication, we study and we have the goal of forming, maintaining, and even ending relationships. You don't need to write down Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but I do like to include it. I'm pretty sure your book kind of talks about it, but I think it's fascinating to put into perspective how important relationships and communication is. So if you look, there's physical needs, which are the basic things that we literally need to stay alive. Safety needs, that is both physical safety, but also psychological safety. And then it's social needs. So social needs is right in the middle. So yes, it's not necessary to stay alive, but also there are plenty of studies where people have been, raised in rooms, and I mean, there's a book about it, and they made it into a movie, raised in rooms where, they didn't have any interaction with anyone, and that really affects them cognitively. Think about in prisons. What do they do when people get in trouble? They get sent to solitary confinement. And I've actually recently heard that solitary confinement is just, not recently heard, I think I'm thinking of something else. Ignore that, scratch that. But solitary confinement is just isolation from other people. That is a form of consequence. We need other people, okay? All right, communication competence. It takes motivation to strengthen your skills, but it is worth it. So I'll let you read that on your own, but that's just kind of some information to keep in mind. Assessing competence, appropriateness. There are high self-monitors and low self-monitors. Low self-monitors are people that don't really pay attention or think before they speak. They just kind of let it all out. And there are high self-monitors that are very aware of what they're saying, how it's affecting the people around them. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. Effectiveness, did you meet the goals for that communication? So in our last slide, we talked about the goals that we have. Did you meet that goal? If you had a goal to get a drink at Starbucks and you just talked to the barista about their day and you never ordered, you did not meet that goal. And then ethical, communication needs to be ethical, do no harm, be honest, and kind. Ethics do play into communication. We need to be ethical when we talk to people. Ethics are kind of a moral compass for our communication. So that is it for chapter 1. Short and sweet, I know, but it's going to get more interesting. If this just bored you to tears, that's fine. I don't love chapter 1, but I promise it'll get better, but we do have to lay the foundation. So that is chapter 1, and we will continue on.